They gave you statues. They gave you monuments. They gave you marble heroes frozen in glory. And they hid everything else. The screaming, the rot, the things soldiers did to survive, and the things they did when survival no longer mattered. History didn't just sanitize ancient warfare. It buried the worst of it so deep, most people never think to look. Tonight, we look. Ancient wars weren't battles of honor. They were rituals of organized horror. And for centuries, the men who wrote history were the same men who needed you to believe otherwise. These are 10 savage truths about ancient wars, the ones they hoped you'd never find. At number 10, water was the first weapon. We picture ancient siege warfare as battering rams and flaming arrows, but the most common tactic was far quieter and far more brutal. Armies surrounded cities, cut off their water supply, and waited, weeks, months, until the people inside began to drink their own waste, until children died first. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD saw survivors so desperate they boiled leather belts for food. The Romans didn't always breach the walls, they just let thirst do it for them. Hunger and dehydration were not side effects of ancient war, they were the strategy. At number 9, soldiers were disposable by design. Generals stood on hills and watched. The men in the front line, the ones who actually touched steel to steel, were considered expendable from the moment they were conscripted. In ancient Rome, decimation was a real punishment. If a unit retreated or failed, 1 in every 10 soldiers was beaten to death by his own comrades, not by the enemy, by the men he fought beside. Loyalty wasn't earned, it was enforced through terror. The battlefield didn't just kill soldiers from the outside, the command structure made sure it could kill them from within. At number 8, wounds killed more than blades did. You survived the charge, you survived the sword, and then 3 days later, the wound you thought was minor began to smell. Ancient battlefield medicine was barely medicine at all. Greek physicians would pour wine into wounds, one of the few things that actually helped, though they didn't understand why. Roman surgeons removed arrowheads without anesthesia, using tools indistinguishable from torture instruments. Infection was the silent second army that followed every battle. Historians count battlefield deaths. They rarely count the men who crawled home and died in their beds 2 weeks later, delirious with fever, alone. At number 7, prisoners were not always taken. The romantic myth, warriors were captured, ransomed, and eventually returned home. The reality, most captured soldiers were killed immediately, not from cruelty alone, from practicality. Prisoners needed food, they needed guards, they were a logistical burden in a campaign where every resource was already stretched thin. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul reportedly resulted in the enslavement or death of over 1 million people. When enslaving wasn't efficient, they simply didn't survive the day they were captured. War had an economy. Mercy rarely turned a profit. At number 6, ancient soldiers carried trauma with no name for it. We call it PTSD now. The ancient world had no name for it, but the symptoms were recorded everywhere. Greek tragedies are filled with soldiers who returned from war unable to sleep, unable to speak, consumed by visions no one else could see. Herodotus describes an Athenian soldier at Marathon who went permanently blind, not from a wound, but from what he witnessed. The body survived, something else didn't. Ancient commanders knew their men returned broken. They held victory celebrations partly to mask it and partly to suppress it before it spread. At number 2, the victors wrote the numbers, and they lied. Julius Caesar claimed to have killed 430,000 enemies in a single campaign. Modern archaeologists, studying burial sites and population data, put the real figure at a fraction of that. Ancient commanders inflated enemy casualties because it justified campaigns, secured funding, and turned generals into gods. The histories we inherited were often nothing more than propaganda drafted by the winners. Every monument, every inscription, every carved triumph, read them as press releases from men who needed you to believe they were chosen by destiny, because the alternative, that it was all just blood and calculation, was far harder to celebrate. At number 1, the smell is the truth they never carved in stone. No monument captures it, no relief carving shows it, no epic poem dares describe it honestly. Ancient battlefields in the days after combat were sites of total biological collapse, tens of thousands of human and animal bodies decomposing under open sky. Disease followed automatically, dysentery, typhoid, infections that spread through water and air. The soldiers who survived the battle then had to camp beside the dead for days. Ancient warfare was not glorious from a distance, it was catastrophic to the senses at ground level. The marble heroes exist because the survivors needed to believe the horror they endured meant something. The statues were never about the war, they were about surviving the memory of it. Every civilization that ever rose to power did so on a foundation of violence it later chose to beautify. The Greeks gave us philosophy and democracy, and the Crypteia. Rome gave us law and engineering, and Carthage in ashes. Ancient war wasn't a failure of human nature, it was an expression of it. The same species that carved the Parthenon also stacked heads at city gates. That's not a contradiction, that's the truth. And if seeing the world a little differently tonight made you feel something, you know what to do.